Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Naomi, for that very kind introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And thank you, everyone, for joining my talk this morning, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to speak to you this morning. And thank you to the organising committee for inviting me to present this morning and kick off COM2020. It's a pleasure to be here. So today I am going to be talking about research undertaken as part of my doctoral and postdoctoral work, and focusing particularly on language learning within the primary school classroom, and in looking at whether there is a role for explicit learning of grammar within this context. So there we go. A bit of a brief outline then of the talk. I'll first of all say a bit about this context and what we know about language learning within England's primary schools. I'll talk a little bit about previous research into early language learning and the role of explicit learning in grammatical knowledge development before presenting the findings of 2 studies investigating this topic. So a bit of context then. In September 2014, foreign languages became a compulsory foundation subject in primary schools in England. So this means that all children should be learning a foreign language in school from the age of 7 to 11. Now, the national curriculum itself is relatively brief, and schools are free to choose which language they teach. So it could be any modern or ancient language. So it could be French, German, Spanish, Chinese, or even Latin or ancient Greek. However, the national curriculum does set out quite high expectations about what students are expected to achieve during this 4 years of language learning, regardless of which language they are learning. So they're expected to be able to engage in conversations and to produce writing in the foreign language. They're expected to have knowledge of the sound spelling system and to demonstrate their understanding of the language when listening and reading. And they're expected to be able to communicate on a range of different topics and with a range of audiences, and to develop knowledge of both vocabulary and basic grammar within that language that they're learning. Now, whilst this change in the national curriculum is a positive step for languages in the UK, it has also come with a number of challenges for primary schools in trying to implement the languages curriculum. In the Language Trends Survey, which is a national survey of language teaching in primary schools in England, time is a key challenge within the primary school. Time has been identified as a key challenge by many primary schools. So around 71% of primary schools in the 2018 survey noted that they have difficulty finding sufficient curriculum time within an already busy primary school curriculum. And in the most recent survey, 81% of primary schools noted that they offer between 30 and 60 minutes of language teaching per week. Now, previous research within the UK context has demonstrated the impact of teaching time on learning outcomes. So studies by Suzanne Graham and colleagues have identified that pupils who receive a minimum of 30 minutes of instruction per week of 60 minutes instruction per week, my apologies, make significantly greater progress than groups who receive less than that. And this has fueled calls for primary schools to be given more guidance on a minimum time allocation for foreign languages within the curriculum. Now, the changes to the national curriculum in England mirror steps taken around the world to lower the age that children begin learning a foreign language in school. And this is very much motivated by the belief that an earlier start will improve learning outcomes and motivate long-term language study, as well as by a desire to improve intercultural understanding and by kind of expectations from parents and within the community. And this belief that an earlier start will lead to better outcomes is driven, at least in part, by the widely held assumption that younger is better when it comes to language learning. And this is fueled by research that has compared early starters, so those who begin learning a language in childhood, with late starters, so those who begin language learning in adolescence or in adulthood. And this research seems to have fairly consistently demonstrated that in general, early starters do seem to have a long-term advantage in terms of ultimate attainment, i.e. being able to reach a very high level of ability in the target language. In contrast, late starters have been shown to have a more short-term advantage in terms of learning rate, so being able to make more rapid progress in the initial stages of learning the language. However, in this context, early starters have been shown to eventually catch up to and overtake later starters, and ultimately being able to reach a higher level of ability in the language. It's important to note, however, that this evidence for young learners' advantage in language learning does come primarily from research conducted within a naturalistic or immersion setting, i.e. where the learner is immersed in the second language environment. In contrast, research within an instructed setting, which offers very limited input, has demonstrated that actually older learners have an advantage and are able to progress faster and further than younger learners, given the same amount of input to both groups. So these differences in rate versus attainment for older versus younger learners is thought to be related to the nature of learning mechanisms that learners have at their disposal at different ages. So young learners are thought to have a much greater propensity for implicit learning, i.e. learning a language without conscious awareness or attention, simply from mere exposure to the language. Whereas older learners, they're thought to have, or their access to these implicit learning mechanisms is thought to be declining, and instead they are more reliant on more highly developed analytical and explicit learning abilities. And so for younger learners, it's thought to be this ability to learn implicitly, which is thought to, at least in part, account for their advantage in terms of language attainment. However, implicit learning requires a huge amount of exposure to the target language. If we consider first language acquisition, for example, young children have thousands of hours of exposure to their mother tongue throughout their early years and beyond. In contrast, in a classroom context, which offers perhaps 60 minutes of exposure to the target language per week, children may not be able to capitalize on their implicit learning ability due to the very limited exposure. Therefore, within this context, I have been interested to explore whether there is a role for explicit learning in developing young learners' linguistic knowledge in a more efficient and effective manner. So within my work, I have focused specifically on the development of young learners' grammatical knowledge in a foreign language within this instructed context. Now, England's primary languages curriculum emphasises the importance of children developing an understanding of basic grammar appropriate to the language that they're studying. So during their 4 years of language learning at primary school, they're expected to develop an awareness of aspects such as noun and verb morphology, an understanding of word order and sentence structure, as well as develop an awareness of the differences between English or their other first languages and the foreign language that is being studied. In this context, language teaching tends to focus on the development of learners' oracy skills, for example, focusing on listening and speaking activities, such as things like songs and games and role play. However, there is concern or uncertainty about how to teach grammar within this context. And indeed, around 3/4 of primary schools have identified that the teaching of grammar is a key challenge they perceive with implementing the primary languages curriculum. So grammar learning then is one area where there has been a huge amount of research concerned with the effectiveness of different instructional approaches. And much of this research has focused on the effectiveness of explicit instruction, or instruction that involves some level of focus on form and perhaps some explanation of particular grammatical rules. In general, these studies have demonstrated a positive effect of explicit grammar instruction. However, a majority of effective instruction research has tended to be carried out with older learners or adults, and only a very small number have been conducted with younger learners. And those studies which have investigated the effectiveness of explicit grammar instruction for young learners have tended to be carried out with learners within an immersion setting where the learner has a much higher level of exposure to the target language. So within our studies then, we have been interested to explore the benefits of explicit instruction and to what extent this would be helpful within the context of young learners learning a foreign language within the limited input foreign language classroom context. So the first study that I am presenting then is a classroom-based experimental study investigating the effectiveness of explicit instruction for the learning of case marking in German. So this was, as I said, a classroom-based experimental study. So we had a pre-test, a 5-week intervention, and then a post-test and delayed post-test. And the experimental group completed or received the explicit instruction during their weekly German lessons within class. The participants were aged 9 to 11, and their first language was English, and they are learning German as a foreign language within school. And this was very much a minimal input environment. They received on average an hour of German per week, and at the point the study commenced had received approximately 2 terms of German, so around 20 hours of instruction prior to the study. And they had minimal or no exposure to the language outside of the classroom. And the target grammatical feature that we were focusing on was definite article case marking in German. So the contrast between the masculine nominative article der, which is used to indicate the subject of the sentence, and the accusative definite article den, which is used to mark the object of the sentence. So we know then that there are certain grammatical features which second or foreign language learners fail to acquire even after many hours of exposure to the target language. And case marking is one such feature. Numerous studies have demonstrated that even very advanced learners of German will tend to overlook case marking cues when listening to or reading in German. And so why is this? Well, one explanation can be found in Van Patten's input processing theory, which sets out a number of principles which seek to explain why learners will have difficulty processing certain grammatical structures in a language. The first noun principle is one such principle which argues that learners will tend to identify the first noun in the sentence as the subject of that sentence. Now, this is not necessarily a problem for languages such as English, where word order is fixed. So in the sentence, the man chases the dog, we know that the man is the subject of the sentence because it's the first noun to appear within the sentence. In German, however, case marking is a much more reliable cue as to who is doing what in the sentence, because word order is flexible in German. So if we look at the example sentence on the screen there, we can, or the first noun principle would predict that learners of German would tend to interpret this sentence as the dog chases the man, because the dog, Hund, appears first in the sentence. However, we can see from the case marking on the articles that the opposite is in fact true. Hund appears with the accusative marked article den, indicating that it is actually the object of the sentence. And so the correct interpretation is in fact that the man chases the dog. So previous studies have consistently demonstrated that English learners will tend to over-rely on word order and ignore these case marking cues, and therefore interpret these sort of sentences incorrectly when listening and reading in German. So how can we help learners to overcome this processing problem then? Well, form meaning mapping is one instructional approach which draws on elements of processing instruction and aims to improve learners' processing of these sorts of problematic grammatical features. So form meaning mapping involves providing learners with a short grammar explanation plus repeated practice via meaningful listening and reading activities. The practice itself is input-based and is designed so as to direct learners' attention to the target grammatical feature by making that feature task essential within the practice. And it does so by removing the cues that learners would normally rely on, so that they have to pay attention to the target feature in order to correctly complete the activity. So if we look at an example then of the practice that learners completed within this study, here they see a sentence and two pictures and have to decide which picture matches the sentence. So in this first example, we can see that both word order and the case marking are in agreement. Man appears first in the sentence with the nominative article der, indicating that the man is chasing the computer. However, in this second example, the word order has been reversed. And so here, because we've taken away the word order cue, which learners would normally rely on, in order to correctly interpret the sentence, they have to be paying attention to the case marking on the definite articles there. And if they're paying attention to the case marking, they will correctly interpret the sentence as the bear greets the gorilla. And so in this way, form meaning mapping activities aim to push the learner to pay attention to the target grammatical form and encourage them to make the correct connection with its meaning or function within the sentence. So within the study then, we measured learning on a battery of outcome measures, including written tasks, a sentence picture matching task, and a gap fill activity, which were designed to tap into learners' more explicit knowledge of the target grammatical feature, as these were untimed and learners were able to reflect and draw on their knowledge of the grammatical rule as they were completing the tasks. We also included a number of oral language tasks, which were designed to test whether the learners were able to use the grammatical feature under greater time and communicative pressure. And finally, we included a metalinguistic task in order to test learners' ability to verbalise the grammatical rule. So on the screen here, you can see the graphs depicting the scores at pre and post test for the experimental group in blue and the control group in green. So the control group were a test-only control group. So during the intervention period, they just received their normal German lessons and no explicit instruction about the target feature. So we can see then from these findings that across the written and oral tasks, for the experimental group who received the explicit instruction, there was an improvement in their comprehension of the case marking on the articles, and this indicated that there was a reduction in their reliance on word order, as these activities included both sentences with the canonical word order as well as with the non-canonical reversed word order, but they were at post-test were able to more consistently correctly interpret both types of item. We also saw an improvement in their production, and this is particularly notable as the instruction itself did not include any production practice. It was all based around those listening and reading activities. But nevertheless, we also saw an improvement in learners' ability to produce the target feature accurately, both in writing and in speech. And finally, we also saw that learners' metalinguistic knowledge had developed. So at post-test in the experimental group, the learners were able to verbalise and talk about the grammatical rule they had been learning about. This second set of graphs then show the scores at delayed post here as well for the experimental group. Unfortunately, due to practical constraints, the control group were not able to complete a delayed post test. However, we can see here for the experimental group that those learning gains we saw at post test were maintained, indicating that they were durable even 9 weeks after the intervention. Having had no additional instruction around this target feature, we still saw those substantial learning gains. Okay, so that first study then demonstrated that even after a relatively short intervention consisting of short bursts of explicit information followed by repeated input practice, the learners had made substantial gains in both their comprehension and their production of the target feature. And so this demonstrates that explicit instruction can be useful for young learners within an instructed classroom context and builds on previous studies demonstrating effectiveness within a more immersion setting. And so these findings are particularly notable given the context in which this study took place. Previous research have found these gains, in previous studies, the observed learning gains have been found within immersion classrooms in which there is a large amount of exposure to target language input, which may serve to reinforce the learning and the noticing of the grammar feature that's taking place during the explicit instruction. However, this study demonstrated that even without lots of extra exposure to the target language, short bursts of grammar instruction can be beneficial and are likely to be achievable even within the time constraints of the UK, of the kind of primary foreign language classroom context, such as that in England. Okay, so studies such as this one then, investigating the effectiveness of different types of instruction, often rely on reporting group level performance, just as I have just reported or presented to you in the previous slides. However, it is important to acknowledge, as Professor Larson-Freeman noted, that group averages can conceal a great deal of variability. And indeed, I've often noticed that studies will often report quite large standard deviations around group means, indicating that even though we see an increase in the group level performance, there is a certain degree, or in some cases substantial variation within the group in terms of the performance of individual learners. And indeed, that was what I noticed when looking at the data for this study. I found that across the tasks at post and delayed post-test, there were large standard deviations for the experimental group. And so I was interested to drill down and look into this variation in a bit more detail by examining kind of individual learner scores. So on the screen here then, you can see histograms of the experimental group scores on the tasks at post-test. So the horizontal axes, the x-axes, represent the possible scores on the tasks, and the vertical axes, the y-axes, represent the number of learners that achieved that score. When we plotted the individual learners' scores like this then, we found that there was a large spread of scores, and indeed for many of the tasks we found this quite striking bimodal distribution seemed to be appearing. So we had a large peak around top scores at post-test. So these were high scorers who did seem to have improved at post-test. But we also found a second subgroup of learners who were performing at around chance level. So despite those significant group level learning gains that we found, some learners did not appear to have improved at post-test. They were still performing at around chance level. And when we analysed the distribution of high scorers at post and delayed post-test, we found that there was no change. So those learners who were high scorers at post-test remained high scorers at delayed post-test, and the same for low scorers. And so this indicated that the group level learning gains could be accounted for by a subgroup of learners within the participant pool. And this really highlighted the importance of individual learner differences in mediating the effectiveness of a given instructional approach, and the importance of drilling down beyond group level analyses to examine the impact of instruction for individual learners. Okay, so how then can we account for this variation? Well, one aspect of individual differences research that has received quite a lot of attention over the last 50 or 60 years is the role of language learning aptitude. Now, traditional operationalizations of aptitude have identified 4 subcomponents: phonemic coding ability, grammatical sensitivity, inductive language learning ability, and associative memory. So in our study, we focused on the second aspect, grammatical sensitivity, which is the ability to recognize the function of words in sentences. We hypothesized that grammatical sensitivity may be particularly important in the context of our study, where the learners were focusing on learning a grammatical feature, case marking in German, which indeed marks the grammatical function of nouns within the sentence, identifying subjects and objects in this case. So to measure the learner's grammatical sensitivity, we used a subtest within the Modern Languages Aptitude Test elementary version, the matching words test. In this test, learners are presented with 2 sentences, as you can see in the example on the screen. In the first sentence, one word is underlined, and the learner has to identify the word in the second sentence, which performs a similar function as the underlined word in the first sentence. So in our analysis then, when we examined the influence of grammatical sensitivity on learners' performance on the outcome measures, we found that grammatical sensitivity was indeed a significant predictor of learners' performance across all of the outcome measures. And so this indicated that grammatical sensitivity does seem to be one factor affecting learners' performance at post and delayed post-test. It's useful to note that within this analysis, even after we had accounted for individual variation due to grammatical sensitivity, we did still see a significant effect of time, indicating that grammatical sensitivity alone did not account for the increase in scores that we saw at post and delayed post-test, so suggesting that there was still a beneficial effect of the intervention. We also looked at the strength of relationship between grammatical sensitivity and performance on different tasks, and we found a moderate strength correlation, particularly for the written and the metalinguistic tasks. So grammatical sensitivity seems to be particularly important for these tasks, which likely reflect more of the learner's explicit knowledge. So these findings then suggest that although explicit learning does seem to be of benefit for younger learners in an instructed context, it is important to acknowledge and be mindful of the individual learner differences, which may moderate the effectiveness of a given instructional approach. So in study 2 then, we extended our work investigating explicit grammar learning, and here we were interested in, or we aimed to design and evaluate a digital game as a platform for providing opportunities for explicit grammar practice and to investigate its effectiveness, again for young learners in this instructed context. So we know practice is critical to the second language learning process, particularly in the development of grammatical knowledge. Learners need sufficient opportunity to engage in meaningful practice, which will facilitate the transformation of initially declarative or explicit knowledge of a grammatical rule to knowledge that can be accessed quickly and accurately during language use. Further, it's important that opportunities for meaningful practice are provided, i.e. practice that is set within a communicative context, which will draw learners' attention to meaning as well as form. And repetition is, of course, key. Learners need repeated opportunities to engage with new language structures in a variety of contexts. Therefore, it is important to balance providing sufficient repetition without the practice becoming too repetitious and therefore disengaging. And so a growing area of research has looked at the role of digital games for supporting the learning process. So games can provide a rich, engaging platform for second language learning. They are inherently goal-oriented. They provide opportunities for interaction both within and beyond the game with other players, and therefore exposure to rich linguistic input. They are often set within kind of whole worlds or built around stories which provide context to the actions the player is completing within the game, and they provide the opportunity for more individualized feedback and for learners to progress at their own pace. So as I mentioned then, the aim of study 2 was to design, develop and evaluate a digital game as a tool to support foreign language grammar learning within the primary school classroom. So the game itself contains a series of mini games, each focusing on a particular grammatical feature. And within this study, we focused on mini games providing practice of French verb morphology, i.e. subject-verb agreement for number and tense in the first and third person. The game utilises the four-mini mapping approach to provide grammar practice within a meaningful game context. So within each mini-game, the learner receives a short grammar explanation and input-based listening and reading practice. For example, the example on the screen here is of a mini-game practicing subject-verb agreement in French for the first person singular versus plural. So in this game, the player in this particular item has to decide whether the robot has said, "I like bananas," or "we like bananas," and therefore whether to feed just the robot who has spoken or all of the robots. And you can see in that example on the screen there that the pronoun has been obscured. And this is in order to focus learners' attention on the target feature, i.e. the verb ending. So in order to correctly identify who is being talked about, the learner has to be noticing and paying attention to the verb ending and understanding the meaning that it indicates, in this case, the ONS ending indicating we. So in this way, as with the intervention in study 1, the aim is to push learners to focus on the grammatical form and make the connection with the meaning or function that it conveys within the input. So within the study, we wanted to explore whether meaningful game-based grammar practice would lead to learning. So again, here we were focusing on young learners within an instructed context. As with study 1, we conducted an experimental study within 6 primary schools, this time working with learners who were learning French as a foreign language. But again, this was very much a limited input context where they received 1 lesson per week and had minimal or no exposure to the language outside of the classroom. So today I'm going to focus in actually on the intervention itself. So one additional benefit of practice provided in a digital medium is the ability to capture detailed data regarding learning as it happens throughout the intervention. Therefore, today in this presentation, I'm going to focus in on the analysis of this data. So the intervention then lasted for a period of 3 weeks, during which time the learners were completing a series of mini-games practicing a number of verb inflections in French. So each mini-game practiced a particular grammatical feature or grammatical contrast, and each mini-game contained 3 question sets, and each question set contained 12 items that the learner had to complete. Each mini-game began with a tutorial alongside the first 2 question items to explain the grammatical rule to the learner and also to demonstrate the functionality of that particular mini-game. If learners answered a question incorrectly, they would receive feedback, and this included an explanation or a reminder of the grammatical rule that they had been practicing. And we also had a reward system built into the game, which is a common feature of game-based practice. So here, learners received a star rating based on how successfully they had completed each level. So if the learner had answered all items correctly, they received 3 stars. If they answered 1 item incorrectly, they lost a star. And if they answered 2 items incorrectly, they would lose 2 stars. And if the learner made 3 mistakes, then they would lose that particular level or question set, but they would have the opportunity to replay that question set once in this particular context. So here we wanted to bring in some game elements and to allow the players some level of control in a more individualized learning experience. So for those learners who very quickly picked up a particular grammatical contrast and spotted the pattern and could apply it correctly, they could move on more quickly. But those who needed more practice had the opportunity for that before having to move on to a subsequent level and grammar feature. But we did restrict this to 1 replay so that we allowed that opportunity to revisit a question set, but also implemented a certain amount of constraint within the context of the experiment so that we could ensure all learners had the opportunity to play through all mini games and had roughly equivalent amount of practice per grammar feature. So within this study, we were also interested to investigate the question of how much practice is needed and how often, i.e. does the frequency or distribution of practice impact learning? Now, this is an important question, particularly in the instructed context where the time available for language teaching is very limited. In addition, technology offers flexibility and the opportunity for learners to engage in practice both within and outside of the classroom. So investigating the optimal distribution of practice is important for informing practice in the classroom, as well as for learning theory and further research. Now, existing research in this area has shown firstly that spaced practice, i.e. providing repeated opportunities for practice that are separated by some amount of time, is more beneficial than practice that is massed into a single session. However, what is less clear is whether the distribution of spaced practice session makes any difference to learning. So is it better to allow a longer period of time between each practice session or a shorter period of time? And the previous research has produced conflicting findings. So some studies have found that longer spacing between practice, say approximately 7 days, is more beneficial than a shorter spacing. However, other studies have found either no difference or have indeed found an advantage for a shorter spacing between practice sessions. So given the kind of practical rationale as outlined above and the greater flexibility afforded by the digital game, this was one aspect we were interested to investigate within the context of our study. So we compared two conditions. One group had one 60-minute session per week within the game. So each session was separated by 7 days. The other group had two 30-minute sessions per week. So each session was separated by about 3 to 4 days. Okay, so as I said earlier then, the digital training we utilised in this study offered a really rich source of information to facilitate more fine-grained analysis of learning during the intervention. In the first study I presented, we saw the variation that was evident in the learner's performance at post-test and delayed post-test. However, digital training, as we've used in this study, allows the opportunity to track learning behaviour in-game during the intervention, which may give a window into why we ultimately see variation in learning outcomes as measured at post-test. So if we look first then at learners' kind of global performance on the game, so we calculated learners' global game accuracy. So this was the total number of questions they answered correctly in the game, in total in the game, divided by the overall number of questions that they attempted. And you can see here that overall accuracy in the game was high, around 80%, suggesting that learners were picking up and able to correctly apply the grammatical rules being introduced and practiced within the game. When we compared the two groups' scores, we did see a slight advantage for the 30 minutes group, so the group who received more frequent practice, the two 30-minute sessions per week. From the kind of global game level then, we can look a bit more closely at how learners performed on each of the mini-games. So each mini-game practiced a particular grammar feature and contained 3 question sets that the learners worked through. So again, we can see that across the mini-games, overall performance was high, although there was some variation with certain grammar features seeming to be more challenging. The first versus third person past tense, for example, that was a particularly challenging game. However, we can see that both of our groups, both the 60-minute group and the 30-minute group, had a similar trajectory across the mini-games. And we also see what may be evidence of some transfer of knowledge here. So the 2 points identified in the green circle, the first one is the mini-game practicing first person agreement for number, so the singular versus plural, I versus we verb endings. And the second point represents the third person, the minigame practicing the third person singular versus plural, so he or she versus they. And we can see that on that second minigame, the third person, the learner's performance was higher, indicating that perhaps the learners were able to pick up or to apply some of the pattern and the rule they'd begun learning in that initial minigame and use that within the second minigame that they attempted. And we also saw this pattern within the mini-games practicing, on the one hand, the first person present versus past tense, and then subsequently the third person present versus past tense. So there did seem to be some transfer of knowledge happening there. So from a mini-game level then, we can drill down further to look at how learners performed across the individual question sets within each mini-game. So here, this is focusing on the mini-game practicing the first person present versus past tense, so the use of the avoir auxiliary. The pie charts depict the percentage of learners who passed each question set on their first attempt, so got 10 correct answers. If you remember, if a learner made 3 mistakes, then they would lose that level and have to replay that question set. So we can see then here from the first question set that a majority of the learners did seem to be picking up the rule correctly and passed that question set on their first playthrough. We see a similar pattern on the second question set, and indeed an even higher proportion of learners managed to pass that question set on their first attempt. So again, this indicates perhaps some transfer of knowledge between the first and second question sets, with learners being able to more reliably apply the grammatical feature. The third question set was the one that offered listening only practice, and noticeably here we saw a different pattern of results, with the majority of learners actually not passing on the first playthrough. And we think this is likely due to the difficulty of distinguishing the first person pronoun je from in the present tense with the j'ai, which includes the avoir auxiliary in the past tense. So that's quite a small phonemic distinction, which the learners seem to find challenging to distinguish or identify. So for these learners, a majority of them didn't pass the listening only question set on their first attempt. So finally then, we wanted to drill down within that question set data to look at the performance of those learners who lost a question set the first time they played through, i.e. those who made 3 mistakes. And we were interested to see, for learners who lost on the first attempt, what did their performance look like when they played again? And what we saw was an increase in their accuracy on the second playthrough. So you can see that across all 3 of the question sets, including the listening only question set, there was an improvement in learners' performance on that second playthrough. And so this does seem to reflect some variation between individuals in terms of how quickly they were picking up and able to accurately apply the grammatical rule being practiced. And for some learners, they did seem to benefit from having that opportunity for more extended practice on the second playthrough. Okay then, so the results I presented then demonstrated that at a kind of group level, overall we saw accuracy was high within the game, suggesting that the practice was effective in developing learners' knowledge of the target grammatical structures. And we saw some evidence of a small advantage for the 30-minute group who had received more frequent practice, which aligns with some previous studies finding an advantage for shorter spacing between practice sessions. The nature of the game made it possible to conduct more fine-grained analysis to explore changes in learners' behaviour within the game. Now, skill acquisition theory argues that practice facilitates the proceduralization of grammatical knowledge, and this is characterized by an increase in accuracy and also how quickly learners are able to apply the grammatical rules. And we saw within our analysis, there was an accuracy in learners' performance, for example, over question sets. There was an increase in accuracy over different question sets. And we also saw evidence of transfer of knowledge between minigames, where learners seemed to be able to apply the rules and patterns picked up in one minigame to a subsequent minigame, practicing a different aspect of subject-verb agreement. For many of the learners, the knowledge they were developing also did seem to be skill specific, so there seemed to be difficulty transferring their knowledge of the grammatical structure from the reading-based question sets to the listening-only question sets, which suggests that more focused listening-only practice would have been beneficial to help learners with kind of tune their ear to those phonemic distinctions they were listening out for. We did also see variation in the rate and extent of knowledge development for subgroups and for individual learners. And when we looked at accuracy within question sets, we saw that the amount of practice needed to begin consistently correctly applying the grammatical rule did vary between learners, with some passing question sets on the first playthrough, whereas others benefiting from having more opportunities to play again. So again, within this study then, we were interested to better understand how we can account for this variation between individual learners and explore why some learners were able to pick up the grammatical rules more quickly than others. So how can we account for this variation that we observe within the game then? Well, in study 1, we saw that grammatical sensitivity, a subcomponent of aptitude, went some way to explaining the variation between individual learners' performance. However, within this study, we hypothesized that we needed to look beyond grammatical sensitivity alone. Engaging in explicit learning of morphology requires a number of different cognitive skills. So learners need to be able to understand rule explanations. They need to be able to apply rules to new input. to identify the functions of words, to spot patterns, and to be able to identify the morphological units or the kind of constituent parts of individual words. Therefore, we hypothesized that this encompassed a wider set of abilities than grammatical sensitivity alone. And so earlier we saw that aptitude is hypothesized to be comprised of 4 subcomponents. And 2 of these subcomponents, grammatical sensitivity and inductive language learning ability, have been proposed to be 2 components of the same underlying ability of language analytic ability. So language analytic ability can be defined as the capacity to infer rules of language and make linguistic generalizations or extrapolations. And language analytic ability is associated with explicit language processing. So a number of studies have demonstrated that language analytic ability is critical for successful grammar learning. It's also important to note that in kind of middle childhood, that age between around 7 and 11 years old, children are undergoing extensive maturational changes, including the development of more sophisticated analytical abilities. Therefore, within the context of our study, we hypothesized that language analytic ability may have some bearing upon the effectiveness of explicit learning for our young learners. Metalinguistic ability has also been identified as important for explicit learning. So metalinguistic ability is identified as the ability to make use of explicit knowledge about language and the ability to shift attention from the meaning to the structure of a message. And recent work by Ruhr-Bracken and Tellier has demonstrated that metalinguistic ability may be predictive of young learners' foreign language proficiency within the classroom. Now, there's quite a lot of debate about the relationship between metalinguistic ability and language analytic ability due to differences in how the 2 constructs are viewed. However, a number of studies have demonstrated that there is a relationship between these 2 constructs and that they may in fact be 2 sides of the same coin. So within our study then, we hypothesized a broader definition of language analytic ability as encompassing metalinguistic ability and both deductive and inductive learning abilities. So the deductive learning ability being able to understand and apply grammatical rules to new linguistic input, and inductive ability being able to spot patterns and to make generalizations based on linguistic input. And we felt that these were the analytical skills a learner would need to draw on in order to successfully learn the morphological features of a new language under explicit learning conditions. So our language analytic ability test then was comprised of 2 main sections. The first focused on learners' L1 metalinguistic ability, so their knowledge of key terminology, their ability to apply rules and patterns in English, and their ability to separate stem and suffix. So the first example there, the learners had to identify the function of words and provide appropriate pronouns to identify the underlined words in sentences, and also to spot singular and plural patterns. In example 2, the learners had to separate verb stem and suffix and demonstrate they understand how words can be broken down into smaller parts. Part 2 of the test then firstly tested deductive learning ability. So here the learners were provided with an explanation of the grammatical rule, an example of an enhanced item, and had to demonstrate their ability to apply that rule to new input. The inductive learning part, in contrast, provided examples but no direct explanation of the rule, and tested whether learners were able to spot patterns and extrapolate rules to complete the table in the second part there. So in terms of their learners' language analytic ability then, when we look at their performance on the test, we can see that overall performance on the test was moderate to high, suggesting that the test was appropriate for distinguishing between learners with different levels of language analytic ability. Notably, we did see substantial variation within the groups, and the 30-minute group did seem to demonstrate slightly higher language analytic ability, which may account to a certain extent for their slightly higher performance within the game compared to the 60-minute group.
Just a couple of minutes, please, Rowena.
Okay, in terms of the relationship between language analytic ability and explicit grammar learning, we found quite a strong correlation between the two things. And notably, this correlation was substantially stronger than for grammatical sensitivity, as we investigated in study 1, suggesting that language analytic ability may more fully account for variation in learners' ability to benefit from explicit learning than grammatical sensitivity alone. So just to conclude then, I know that was a whistle-stop tour through two quite complex studies, but what these findings demonstrated then was that young learners do seem to be able to engage in explicit learning. And for many, particularly in study 1, we saw that this explicit instruction led to the development of explicit knowledge that was verbalizable, as well as development of knowledge which is accessible under time and communicative pressure. And we saw in study 2 that digital game-based practice did seem to be particularly beneficial in providing opportunities for learners to progress at their own pace, and for those learners to have more practice if they needed it. These studies also, however, demonstrated that the effectiveness of instruction does seem to be mediated by individual learner differences, and emphasises the importance of considering these differences and within group variation when we're investigating the effectiveness of a given type of instruction. And so why are certain treatments effective for some learners but not others? Well, in these particular studies, we found that language analytic ability and grammatical sensitivity were significantly related to learning under explicit conditions. And indeed, language analytic ability did seem to bear the stronger relationship to explicit grammar learning. Of course, here we have only considered one area of individual differences, but these findings speak more generally to the importance of considering individual learner differences in both research and practice in order to inform decisions about which type of instruction may be most effective for the learning of particular aspects of the language. In this case, there does seem to be a role for explicit learning of foreign language grammar within the primary school languages classroom. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rowena. That's absolutely wonderful. And there are quite a few questions have come in while you've been talking, not surprisingly. So
okay.
I just let you sit back and have a quick sip of water there while I just read a few of those questions. So our first one is from Christine Leong, and she says, "Hi Rowena, may I ask about the intensity, e.g. length of the explicit instruction in study 1? So that's intensity, and whether the experience of the control group towards the grammatical rule taught had been carefully matched to the experimental group." So got kind of two in one there.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in terms of the intensity of instruction, the intervention lasted over 5 weeks, and so there were 5 sessions. So they had about 40 minutes of instruction per session. So that included a brief explanation at the start to talk about the grammatical rule, and then practice activities of the nature that I showed you in the presentation. The second question, in terms of matching the control group, so in this context, the control group were a test-only group. So they, during the period of intervention, they reverted back to their normal kind of grammar teaching that they would normally have received within the classroom. And so they would have seen instances of the target feature within that input, but they didn't have any explicit instruction directing their learning specifically to that grammar feature or explaining the rule. So they were there as sort of a test-only group in this context.
Thank you. Lovely answer, Rowena. Okay, we've got another one here from Uta. My apologies for mispronouncing anybody's name. That happens to me all the time. Uta asks, have you also looked at other case markers, for example, dative, genitive, not only direct object accusative?
Yeah, thank you. So no, I haven't personally in my study. I think there is other research looking at that and looking at this type of instruction for developing knowledge of those different case markings. I haven't personally within the context of these studies. The rationale for choosing the kind of nominative accusative markers was because they are often introduced in the earlier stages of learning a language, and they're needed even to form quite simple sentences in the language. So that was why in this context we focused on those grammatical features.
Lovely, great. Question here from Thomas Back, who is giving our closing part of the presenter of our plenary on Thursday afternoon. Welcome, Thomas. Thomas asked, in fact, I was interested in this question as well, and he says, were any of the children exposed to other languages, for example, in the family or the neighbourhood, or living in an environment where other languages are being spoken?
Yeah, thank you. So in the context of these studies, no, we did control for that. So these were all monolingual English speakers. So as far as we know, they didn't have any exposure to other languages within the context of their home. They may well have been, you know, on holiday abroad occasionally or something, but they didn't have regular exposure outside of the classroom. And obviously it wasn't possible to control what they were doing outside of the classroom, but from their reports and from speaking to the teacher and from speaking to the children, it was very rare for them to be engaging in any language practice outside of the classroom.
Okay, and there was another question like that from Beatrice as well, asking whether maybe some learners knew other heritage languages, which might have helped with German cases. So that's a kind of an ongoing, difficult to answer one in a way, but a fascinating question. Another one here from Gunnar Jacob. Thanks a lot for the talk, Rowena. We're all thinking that. To what extent do you think it's possible to generalize your findings for case marking, A, to other grammatical phenomena, such as inflection, agreement, or syntactic representations, and B, to other languages, particularly given that phenomena such as case marking in German possess highly specific properties?
Yeah, thank you. So, well, the first thing, obviously, across the two studies, we looked at case marking in the first one, but then did also look at inflectional morphology in the second study. So showing that, you know, and that was a different language. So showing that this method does seem to be quite, or this type of instruction does seem to be effective across different languages and different types of grammatical feature. And this particular kind of teaching approach, this type of explicit instruction, has been researched quite widely. With a number of different languages, kind of Italian, Spanish, English. I think there may have been studies with Chinese, sort of all sorts of different languages. So there's quite a lot of robust evidence looking at this type of instruction. A majority of it is with older learners, but there's sort of growing evidence, or growing amount of evidence, also looking at its applicability for younger learners too. So yes, it does seem to generalize beyond just the features that I talked about here today. Yeah.
Thank you, Rowena. And I'm afraid we've got time for only one more. There are actually quite a few more in the Q&A stream here, so maybe we can type answers later or something. But Jess asks a question on a different kind of strand, and she says, would you be able to provide examples of digital games that you have used in the studies? I guess a lot of us are very excited to know about the actual nuts and bolts of what you were doing educationally.
I'm not sure. I should have got a video prepared or something so you could see how it actually works within the presentation. I'm sorry I didn't think about that. But you saw some screenshots there of the different games. So essentially, just to give a little brief bit of background, essentially the game is based around a spy theme. And so the player is a spy and they're having to complete different missions within the game. And that kind of provides the kind of meaningful communicative context. And the idea is that the players have to be paying attention to these grammar features to learn how to communicate successfully in order to be able to complete these missions. And so we saw what the one particular example there, where the robot, the player is with the robots and deciding who needs what food. There's another the mini game where they're practicing the present versus the past tense. The context of the game is that they're receiving mission reports from other agents in the field. So they have to stamp mission files with either ongoing, i.e. the sentence was in the present tense, or with mission completed, i.e. it's in the past tense, so the player's already done that thing. So that's the sort of elements that we have within the game. And yeah, at the moment we're trialing the game with a number of schools within the UK, but we are hoping to make it available, freely available more widely later in the year. So yeah, watch this space and hopefully then you'll be able to go and have a play yourself.
Thank you so much, Rowena. Thanks